And it's planted as with fruit guild principles with certain companion plants in association with it. And that is totally cool, but it isn't necessarily that this is the only way to create ecosystem biodiversity. So if your setting is one where everything is mowed and nothing's going to flower, you really vitally need to do something like this to create some aspect of diversity. But when your farm, your landscape is such that there's all sorts of things happening everywhere, you get a lot of the dynamics that are at play here. So two terms from permaculture that I really appreciate in terms of plant interaction with fruit trees. One is the dynamic accumulator. And here we're talking about tap-rooted plants that bring up certain subsoil minerals, and those minerals go into the leaf and the flower stalk and the flower, and when that plant goes through its cycle and falls over and decays, those minerals are now available on the surface of the plant. So I like lots of tap-rooted plants. So here we have dandelion, which is known for helping accumulate potassium, and elecampagne, which is a member of the sunflower family. We grow that for the herb, for the root, because it's a great expectorant for helping clean out the lungs. But it's, as a member of the sunflower family, long about the end of July, early mid-August, bumblebees are all over it. And when I want to have bumblebees in the spring to pollinate my fruit trees, most all of those bumblebees are going to be queens, and they will not have yet achieved a brood that is going out to forage. So you need a lot of different bumblebee colonies to have a lot of queens. And to achieve that, you need to have lots of flowering things throughout the whole season. And your whole pollination scene is going to be driven by, there's about 80 species of bees that will pollinate fruit trees. And most of those are solitary ground nesters. And so another part of the biodiverse environment that I want to create at my farm is somewhere I want patches where there's open ground. That might be where a ramial wood chip pile was, or a compost pile the year before. I move it around because I want patches of open ground. It might be this edge of a sandy parking lot or a road. But these are bees who are going to put their eggs in the soil, and it's going to emerge from that place next year. And they do the majority of the pollinating, particularly the early flowering things like the plums.
Are you saying bare ground? Or
mostly bare ground, open ground.
But I mean, where the earth is naked.
Yes.
Okay, got it.
Like the edge of a fill spot. But again, it's we don't think about that, but there are species that tie into different elements of biodiversity. Another plant here that is really, really valuable, this is valerian. And valerian is one of those tiny flowering plants. It's big flower stalk, but it's actually a lot of little tiny florets. And that's in the category of a beneficial accumulator. So we're about to talk about insect pests. And a beneficial accumulator is something that serves as a nectary, a food resource for the adult form of things like parasitic wasps, which in turn lay their eggs in the eggs of pest caterpillars, in the eggs of pest moths, and their larvae. And the more we have little flowering things, like valerian or sweet Sicily is one I like a lot as well. Or if you grow rhubarb. Rhubarb's a great plant around an apple tree. A couple reasons if you think about it. Big fat roots, so it's not, in terms of density of that cubic foot, there's room in the humus underneath those big leaves. Big leaves that are helping suppress a really thick growth otherwise. Rhubarb crisp at lunch, and on top of which, if you don't get nutso about harvesting every stalk of rhubarb to eat or put up, and you leave some of those flowering canes happen, watch it, and you will see a whole universe evolve around that flower. All sorts of little tiny parasitic wasps, which are what are keeping codling moth and oriental fruit moth and etc. in check in your orchard. So again, diversity, really important. Another aspect, elecampagne, a member of the sunflower family. Jerusalem artichoke, a member of the sunflower family. Sunflowers, definite members of the sunflower family. There is a sunflower moth that associates with these plants. And there is a particular braconid wasp, I forget its name right now, that will go after the sunflower moth larva. and it will overwinter in sunflower-type debris. So elecampagne stalks that aren't necessarily cut down and taken to the compost in early fall, but left there through the winter, or sunflower patch, where you don't clean it up. You let the birds that are migrating in fall get some of the seeds, and you let the stalks there. That is a way of helping this particular braconid overwinter, and it has a definite affiliation to also find the oriental fruit moth. And oriental fruit moth, second, third, fourth generations are going to get the fruit, but the first generation that comes every year goes for the stems of peach trees and apple trees, particularly peach trees. And this particular braconid is really good at finding a stem borer, of which this is a type, and parasitizing its larva, and it finds about 80-90%. You increase the numbers by being diversely unneat by leaving some debris. We grow echinacea, and echinacea, herbally, we make tinctures of seed, root, and plant, leaf, and flower, and we do a whole plant tincture by combining all these different things. Leave echinacea flower stalks in place, and you'll see the birds eating all kinds of echinacea seed. That's their moonbeams for the big migration ahead. Too often we're too neat. We need to let things be a little coarser and wilder. So here's a tree where this deliberate association, goldenrod, also, when you weed and you dig up a plant, and you kind of see how its root system fills the space, goldenrod is one that, for the amount of plant you get on the top, relatively doesn't have that much root. And that just means more room for fruit tree, feeder roots. Those are the kind of plants you want to see. Some grass in the mix is okay, but it's so different from a total sod system. And then another one here, this is the marshmallow, which is a big tap-rooted plant, and now I see it just starting to come up. But it also attracts all kinds of insects to its flowers, and that's the dynamic that you want in place. It doesn't have to be right up against the tree, but throughout the ecosystem. And we only know like a tip of the associations, of really the tip of the iceberg. Another example is when you grow blueberries and you grow apples. Not necessarily right next to each other, but in the same ecosystem. Blueberries are subject to a pest called the blueberry maggot fly. Apples are subject to the apple maggot fly, and they are exactly like they sound. They make the fruit all mushy because their larva, the little worm, is a maggot, and it's just making a mess of the fruit that you want to grow. Well, when you have both pests, because you're growing both plants in vicinity, you have a braconid wasp species whose numbers go up because it has more food resources spread throughout the season. And that kind of association is what leads to you having more, in the end, net pest control. So yes, you have to have the pests to have the beneficials. If we wiped out all the aphids, then we wouldn't have all those things that eat aphids. There has to be a little give and take. When you see aphids on a tree, you really need to quell a notion of panicking that you have to do something. So if I'm growing some young trees in a nursery and see a lot of aphids on the tips, I will probably smush the tips. On the other hand, if I see that happening in my plum tree or in my more mature apples, I know that in a day or two, the ladybugs are going to find them. Ciphid flies are going to come, and their larva is going to eat 40 aphids a day apiece, and that kind of dynamic is going to balance things out in the end. Having things like stinging nettle, not necessarily under the tree. That's where some of it's really taking off in our orchard, which is great for us because that's a crop. But stinging nettle is subject to a tiny black aphid, which is like the first aphid of the season. And for most of us, we don't even think about it. It's irrelevant. Losing some nettle is no big deal. That black aphid enables ladybugs and other predators to start building their numbers so that when the green aphids and the rosy apple aphids appear on the fruit tree, they're up to speed. Again, it's just a little connection in terms of diversity. Growing stone fruit in the vicinity of apples. Stone fruit, their bud scales secrete exudates. That's why you write books and you can edit yourself. You have time. Secrete exudates that ladybird bug beetles can feed off of. And that also gives them a jump start. So it's all about all kinds of diversity, both in the fruits you're growing. It's not all just for us. It all ties together. It weaves together.